Haven't done a longer form video in a while, and I thought it may be interesting to walk really in depth through something that I would call a GTM system. Maybe the word is too big for that, but what I'm going to show is like the workflow end to end with all elements, basically columns and clay going into it to achieve lead scoring and automated outbound. So this is a system that runs through about 10,000 incoming leads per week, scores those leads, enriches with that in order to score them. Of course, there needs to be data acquired, which is exactly the data this client wants for their GTM or for this campaign and generally for their lead scoring. And then this is also fed into outbound systems. In this instance, Apollo is used as a sequencer and the CRM is Attio. So what's in this workflow? I call it integrated GTM system. It's 100% hands-off. So this thing just runs. It has Clay's auto-delete feature in the workspace, meaning that you don't run into the problem of the 50,000, 60,000 rows. But like once rows have processed, 24 hours later, they are deleted. It's a super valuable feature for flows like this. So how the flow goes is lead ingestion. In this case, it's not quite inbound, but like it's a marketing email that is sent out in a very high volume. And there is like a trigger when somebody engages with some of the content in that email, they are put into this sequence, into the system. This is kind of the foundational signal we were looking at. Now that we have the system in place, we have already layered on other signals to that, but I thought I'd go back to kind of what was the foundational build that I did here. Lead ingestion, then the lead scoring is happening and everything that has to do in order to get to that scoring. Contact enrichment, of course, finding emails, and that is pushed into the CRM and into the email. So let's get into it. In terms of system setup or how it's like architecturally set up is the user action happens and is registered in the client's database, in this case Postgres, or it's registered in Iterable, and from there it goes to Postgres. From Postgres, we are sending via webhook the data, which is basically the LinkedIn URL of the person who received the email or who did an action on the email. And that LinkedIn URL is the starting point for what's happening Clay side, which is the lead qualification itself, acquiring the data, seniority check, firmographics, the rich data that we are building there. Those that make it through the lead qualification, then we enrich the contacts we actually want to reach out to, which is a really important element. What I think, especially with that amount of leads, can be underappreciated because of the 10,000 leads. I think we may be enriching 600 of them or something like that. So in terms of cost, you can always purely look at the cost of what does one enrichment cost, but actually building something in front where you really only enrich who you really want to talk to, which is not so wild when you live in this world, but like when you don't do that lead qualification ahead of time, you would enrich 10,000 of these, and then you reach out and then you get bad response rates and so on and so on. So like putting the lead qualification, which is actually lead disqualification at the beginning, is incredibly valuable for bandwidth, for cost, for attention. Think of all the downstream effects of reaching the best quality leads versus trying to reach anything that resembles a lead or isn't even a lead, and you just reach out and see what happens. For the contact enrichment, we find work emails. From here, this is like, I'm not gonna get into that, but we mapped out exactly what data do we want to push to Attio, exactly what data do we want to push to Apollo, and like then in Apollo as a sequence, depending on certain routing criteria, the email to that person coming into this workflow is going out from the right rep for this market segment. And without further ado, let's get into the workflow. So I blurred the PII here. I know that looks a little bit unusual, but this also allows me to go really in depth over all of this. So maybe I go over the workflow once completely and then I will go into the details. So let make myself a little bit smaller. Can I scroll? Yes. So the idea here is on the left, scrolling is really difficult. On the left, you see the webhook coming into play. This is basically the LinkedIn Slack of the person who interacted with the email. And then we have a few system side things. So we have like a personal email, not so interesting. We already have a phone number. We have the LinkedIn Slack, which is what I'm using to deduplicate. So we don't run on contacts we have already run it. It's also the deduplication is already happening on the client side. So that's not that important. Here's the campaign, so we can identify what was the campaign somebody interacted with, and then like enrichment of the person. And I'm going to go into more detail here, as I said, seniority filter. So who do we actually want to talk to? We only want to talk to director level and up. This is the filter that's happening here. The next thing that happens is I would build these things quite differently today. This is kind of a thing. This was built a few months back, so there are better ways to do it, but maybe it's one way to do it, I would say. And I'm happy to go into some detail here. This is where we find the data we want for the qualification. This is not super wild. There is one thing that's a little more interesting in terms of rich data, but otherwise it's pretty standard data points. They are just built in a way where they are really, really cheap at a very high quality. And I'm going to get into that. This is like all the data points we need in order to do the scoring, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so here we go. And here we have the tiering. That looks like what is even happening here. The interesting thing is you have to look at disqualified is a major and actually a very important, very positive outcome in a certain way, because all these DQs mean you would have enriched that person in terms of contact enrichment and tried to reach out to them, but you actually didn't want to. So this is where one of the big values comes in, that all of this is empty is actually a good thing. As it happens, by chance, there is just no tier 1 lead in this. There are a couple tier 2 leads, and I'm going to get into that, but that's kind of just how this, you want generally, of course, you want a lot of tier 1 leads, but the idea here is it is what it is, and you want to reach out to the most valuable leads. This is then sent to another table that actually does the contact enrichment, and this is just logic for the auto delete. From here, let's get into contact enrichment. What you see here is taking in all the data we got from the first table. This is only leads that I think are tier 1 and 2. From here on, we pull in those leads. We do all the little things like normalize the company name and fun stuff like that. That should always be included in something like this. Here we have the tiers. This is like a little bit what you see here are different leads than what you saw in the other table because of like when it's auto deleted, so that you don't get thrown off that this has a tier 1 and the other that I showed didn't have a tier 1. Then the standard waterfall, right? So this is super simple. It's the only custom change here is that I put lead magic in the beginning of the workflow because they have really good data, and yeah, it just makes most sense to put them at the start. The client also has a direct account with them, so it's even cheaper to get that data. Very few of these are even needed, but of course we want to optimize coverage and quality, which you can do here. And then this was actually, I would say, the most time-consuming part of that build, because it's basically get in the qualified leads, find their work email, and then we needed to get to this point. We are here, and we needed to send them to Attio and to Apollo. And that is, basically, I would say, just a lot of custom API work, because these are not natively integrated tools. And what you basically need to do is get familiar with the API documentation there and come up with a lot of JSON and a lot of logic. But what that means, and this is actually where on my side and also on the client side, where this magic moment kind of happens, is when automatically data just shows up. So what you see here is a screenshot of the CRM, again, without PII, so I'm not going to go live into the CRM, but like these have come in here with attribution of the lead source also. So for example, marketing email is the signal that pushes somebody into the original scoring table. And now we are layering in other signals, which will have different attribution, different lead source. So it's like also very easy to report on that and to measure performance. Tier 3, Tier 2, these data points coming from the original workflow, going back to the Clay workflow, this Tier 3, Tier 2 is what you see here. And the trick here is that you can't just write. First, it's not native, so it's not just a click to get it there. And the second part is, since these are pick lists, meaning you can go in here and say, like, okay, you don't do it with Tier 3, but this is how it's set up. And maybe you want to change it at some point. You can change that value. So in the CRM, it's a pick list. So you have to build in the logic so Clay writes correctly into that type of data, which is just a little bit more complicated than just writing a pure text field. So yeah, this is like end to end how it looks like. I want to go back one time. User does an action. This is registered, sends it to the database. Database sends it to Clay. Clay does the lead qualification. For the qualified leads, we enrich work emails. Then we send the data that we want for the leads that are qualified and where we found a valid work email. We send that data into the client CRM, which in this case is Attio, and we send it to the client sequencer, which in this case is Apollo. And from there, the email goes out from the rep and they are receiving the responses and can pick it up from there. Or go into their CRM and do manual stuff on that, because they don't have to sift through 10,000 leads a week. They can sift through maybe 250 tier 1 leads or something like that, if the capacity is there for that. But this all runs completely hands-off. This is like, it's a little bit of an older build from end of last year, which is ages in GTM terms, right? But the point is, this thing has run through hundreds of thousands of leads. And I think that makes it an interesting exercise to just look at how a system like that really looks on the Clay side. And back to the Clay build. So what's interesting here? When you look at the data received from the webhook, that's basically a bunch of JSON. And I don't want to like click on the individuals here, but basically you receive data like the LinkedIn URL and the name and whatever. And this data is just mapped out into Clay here. So you get all of this into the workflow. And from here, the actual first thing that needs to happen, I mean, it's always the building the data and then doing things with the data, right? And the way I think about that is, how can I qualify out? What do I need to know first in order to make a determination if I want to move forward with this lead or this company or this person into the workflow? What do you actually need in order to get to the outcome that you want? And in this case, we need to know basically where's this person working. So far we have the name, we have the email, but we don't really know where they are working. It could be a Gmail address or whatever is in there, but we do have the LinkedIn URL. So what's happening here is a lead magic pull looking at the person profile URL, and lead magic is natively integrated into Clay, but like the profile finder, profile enrichment, that's an HTTP API basically. But what that gives us is like data points, and there's two data points that are really important. What is the person's title? We don't have that yet. And what is their current company? The interesting or the important part about the title is, with the title, we really run a very simple seniority check, which is basically certain titles are a fit, certain titles are not a fit. And the way this is implemented, and I'm going to show it in a second, is just like this, where if title contains any of these, and we came up with like a really good list that will not be absolutely perfect. There can be certain titles where you would say, this is a VP, but maybe we shouldn't have talked to him, whatever. Like, you have these things, and you can also do this semantically with like using AI and making a determination if it's a fit title. But tomato, tomato. So in this case, this worked. This is all the variations and all the indicators where we say this is a good fit title. And most of them aren't. Many of them are just lower than the level we want to talk to. So this is the first thing that really slims down this swell of inbound leads. And it's the most fundamental determination we can make if somebody should be qualified or not. This is just important. You can enrich all kinds of things, but what I want to know first, is the person senior enough to be in our ideal persona? And if they are not, we are just not going to do other work on that. One thing that I wanted to point out is already, so like this auto delete domain thing, what that basically does, it's already skipping to the end, but like my auto delete domain is a domain I made up because if this domain exists, then later in the workflow, we will actually look at if this domain exists, then look at if another action has run, if the profile has been pushed to the enrichment workflow or to the enrichment table that finds the work emails. So this is kind of how it's implemented, that auto delete in Clay basically looks at, has this enrichment column run? And if it has, then you delete the row, and you need like some anchor for that, which is like in my case, the auto delete domain. This will make more sense later in the workflow. I just wanted to explain why there is this weird auto delete domain here. Okay, so I think I also just didn't explain that really well. That will make more sense later on. So here we now actually do a company enrichment. We know let me go back here. We know now the person's title. We have checked they are senior enough. Then we want to enrich the company. Okay, wonderful. We see the company here. We have then employee count. We have the industry. We have the latest funding. I'm building the funding separately, but like this was also in the lead magic enrichment. Anyways, so what's happening here? This is kind of interesting because probably these days you wouldn't have to do that if a company is public or private. But at the time, it wasn't in the lead magic enrichment if the company is public or private. You have that when you do the standard LinkedIn enrichment, where it's just a data point, but here it wasn't there. So there are so many different ways to do this, right? I would build it differently today. I just want to explain how it was built at the time. There is basically a Google search happening for company name public-private. Again, many different ways to do this. I don't think it's the best way, but like it's the way I've built it in this instance. This search is for public-private. This gives us like these search results, and there you have like in the snippet, because that's what we did the Google search for. This snippet is the little thing you see on the Google search page that usually gives you the context around the search term that you looked for. So this will nearly always give us the context, is the company public or private? Again, I wouldn't build it again at this time, but anyways, this is how it went. And now we have the data, and then what's happening here, company classification. I also prompt very differently these days, but this basically looks at, look at this input data and tell me if the company is public or private. And with that, we know the company type. This is important because we want to work for private companies, or we want to talk to private companies, not public. So we need that data point. What you see here, and this is kind of an interesting thing, like funding. Yes, you can use an enrichment and look for funding, and that will cost anything between 1 and 4 Clay credits. I think generally when you don't have an account, it's like 4 Clay credits, which is pretty expensive for just a single data point. So what you can instead do is basically build a Clayagent that goes out and finds that company's funding. I don't want to make this a Clayagent session per se, but this is kind of the output you get. Result is this amount, and we have the funding. The same has happened here with funding stage. So let me quickly have a look at the Clayagent. Again, I do these Clayagent things very differently these days. For example, I use structured JSON and so on and so on. But you'll get the idea, right? Your task is to determine the latent funding stage of a startup, and then there's a few. Actually, here that's very, very simple. Because there's so much good data on that, it's not super crazy. And what's important here, again, I would build it differently today, but what's important here is to really restrict the output to any of these outputs, and what we get is just that. We get the series of the company. Did they raise VC money? That is a data point that is in here that we changed a little bit. Initially, it was like raised from a top tier VC, but then we changed it to just from any VC. So kind of when it's a startup, they have to have raised, but that's why it's in there. And this is how you can build it. This is a Claygen just giving us this data point. And also, what I want to point out, this is actually quite important. I talked about the cost of this. If you use a Clay credit, 4 Clay credits would be about 4 cents on this plan. 4 cents is this, what we are looking with the cost. Give me a second. Oh, okay, doesn't work when I zoom. So total cost to the provider is not 4 cents, not 400th of a cent, but like, I don't even how to call this. This is 6,000ths of a dollar. That is like, whatever, like it's 40 times cheaper than using one of these integrations. That makes a major difference to a cost of a workflow like this. I can't stress this enough, how important it is to get good at building Claygens for getting to data points like this, because it makes literally a 40x difference for the cost of the workflow. This is interesting. This is kind of a little bit of secret sauce, but also not super crazy. So what we want to know is a given company hiring sales roles? And what's happening here is you can again use an integration where you say, oh, is this company hiring SDRs? So you go to add enrichment, you go to open roles, I think, find active job openings, and then you can, it's pretty good. You can give it some keywords and so on, give it a company identifier, and then you get, I think, like a number of jobs that the company is hiring, something like that. I wouldn't say it's super expensive, but it's also a little bit restrictive. It just wasn't up to the level of granularity that I wanted. And so the logic here is I use Serper for Google Search, which is an HTTP API where you basically get the results in this format. These would be the search results you would get on the Google page, and you get those programmatically via the API. And what you see here is kind of the setup. What this basically says is company name. So if this is interesting because this runs conditionally. So if company name, if seniority check is true, don't get thrown off that all of these are true, whatever. Technical reason, usually that's not the case. Forget about it. So if seniority check is true, then say company name and open roles or jobs or careers or open positions. That basically gives you a result, let's say, whatever. Apple is the company name. Then you have a search term Apple and brackets, open roles, or whatever, Clay, open roles, jobs, careers, whatever. And it gives you the results of that search. What's happening next, and this is kind of a little bit of the secret sauce in this, is that the Claygen, the web scraper, basically gets very clear instructions what to do. What I like to control is exactly what roles do we consider a sales role. I didn't ask the team about it. I used AI, of course, to say, hey, what are the top 10 most or top 20 most frequent role descriptions for sales? And it looks specifically for these. I also gave it an instruction that it can be slight variations of this. So if it's like CSO, it can be like a slight variation of this, or if it's chief sales officer, slight variation, things like that, right? But by and large, this is what it's actually looking for. And I'm also telling it not to do any Google searches on its own. But what I'm actually doing is, you remember in the Serper search where we get the results of the search we did, from here on, I'm plugging in exactly these results, which is where these companies are actually speaking about their open jobs, which can be Glassdoor or the company website or whatever. And I'm passing it the top 3 results of this. So wherever this company is talking about their jobs, this will be in there, because if it doesn't show up in the first 3 Google results, this company will not get any applicants from wherever they look for jobs. Also, because I know the LinkedIn slug of the company, I can ask it to visit exactly the company's LinkedIn page. I would build it a little bit differently today, because LLMs can be thrown off a little bit, because when you go to a company's LinkedIn jobs page, other jobs also show from other companies, and that could be a little bit misleading. Then you have to like account for, hey, make really sure it's this company and this and that. So it's not perfect. I would build it a little differently, but it works as it is already really well. And there's a cost to retooling this thing and making it better. For some marginal improvement, the risk of breaking something in a workflow that works really well is just larger than the potential gain. So I didn't touch it. Blah, blah, blah. A little bit more like, again, this is not a Cajun session, but like make sure that it's an actual job posting of the company. Make sure you don't find a review of the company. How good or bad is it to work there? And then you say, oh, this company is hiring for AEs because an AE complained about the company or whatever. So you can blacklist, you can say, hey, don't look at jobs on glassdoor.com/reviews or whatever. These are the things that have to go into a Clagent in order to produce high quality data. And then we have the output, restricting the output, and we basically get a yes or no. What I have found to be a really good hack is Clagents generally, like for something like this, I want to show you something, is that if it says this, yes, Cardinal Health is actively hiring for several sales-related roles, including territory sales representative. What I have found is that you find very little false positives, in a sense of that the Clagent says, oh yeah, this company is hiring, and they are in fact not hiring. Yes, it happens in a 1-digit % rate, but by and large, it rather misses something. I don't have an example here, I think, but let me quickly look. Okay, in this instance, there is no example of that, but like what I'm doing is I run the same Clagent one more time, no changes whatsoever. So take this data, look for open roles, and then again take this data and look for open roles. So it has one more pass at this. And sometimes it does find the role it couldn't find in the first pass. And the reason for that is scraping is technically something that sometimes works. 5 seconds later, it may not work, or the other way around, because mostly Clagent doesn't find open roles if they are there when it in that instance couldn't access the website. So what I'm doing is run the same Clagent again, no changes, with just one thing, which is a conditional formula only run if the response from the first Clagent run is no. So if the response is yes, it won't run again, because I don't want to introduce more breaking points. It only runs again if the first Clagent didn't find open roles. And the bringing this all together is pretty simple, which is with a formula. And these, well, I hope you're here for the details, right? So which is a formula, you can use a merge column, but honestly, I don't even remember why it needed to be built this way. But what this formula basically does, look at both responses, at the response from the first Clagent and the response from the second Clagent. And if any of these responses are yes, then say yes. If both contain a no, then say no. And this is how you get this output. If any of the two Clagents are positive, yes, they are hiring sales. If both are negative, no, they are not hiring sales. And here we are in an interesting territory, because it looks so deceivingly simple. And honestly, it kind of is. But the most important part about the scoring is to get really, really clear on the scoring criteria. So what I'm not showing here is a document that laid out exactly tier 1. The conditions for a lead being a tier 1 lead are this. The conditions for a lead being a tier 2 lead are this. and the conditions for disqualified are that, and for tier 3 are that, kind of the other way around. And why you see it like this, there are many different ways to implement this. I've implemented different logic to score or tier accounts and leads. This is just one way to do it. Maybe it's interesting, so I'm going to go a little bit in depth here. So basically, what you see here, a lead is a tier 1 if the company is private, if the total funding is more than 5 million, if they are hiring sales, and if they have raised money from a VC. That makes it a tier 1 lead. There is actually 2 more elements to this, but like I don't want to give away the whole secret sauce. I don't know. I don't think it's anything too crazy, but kind of this is how basically going from the document where this makes a tier 1 lead to codifying and taking these conditions and making a formula out of this. This is where the beauty of the AI formula editor comes in, because I wouldn't be able to write this part of that, but I can write this part of that. And it's still, again, it's not rocket science, but you really have to be clear on these conditions, these sets of conditions, factors that make it a tier 1 lead. The more challenging part here is really getting all your kind of herding your sheep and aligning the teams and getting everybody on the same page. What is actually a tier 1 lead, then actually executing it. What you see here, why is there tier 2.1, 2.2, 2.3? Because there are multiple sets of conditions which all make a tier 2 lead. So it can be this set of conditions, or this set of conditions, or that set of conditions, and they all make a tier 2 lead. Let's go into one. So for example, if the company is private and the industry contains any of these industries, and they are founded after 1990, and they have more than 5 employees, and they have a certain amount of funding, but they are not necessarily hiring for sales jobs, that is one set of conditions for a tier 2 lead. Just as an example, how these things come together. And like, this would be boring to go through all of these, because it's just really the methodology of what are the determining factors for a tier, for a lead, and then codifying those into the these formulas. And then it's really putting it all together. So going here, final tier is just a merge column, which looks first at, is it disqualified? If it is, then this is the first thing we want to look at. Then if it says tier 1, boom, boom, boom. And this is how you get to just one final column that gives us the tier. And since this goes through a lot of leads every week, we would hit the 50,000 row limit pretty quickly. And there's some data inconsistency here, but you just exclude that. Generally, it works like this. So now that we know which are the leads, this is very important, which are the leads that we want to actually enrich contact data for. Now that we know this, we write only those which are not disqualified to the other table, which is this table from lead qualification. Who do we actually want to enrich? And this is what you see here, write to other table, where we basically have a conditional formula, which is, where is the conditional formula? There, which is basically only run if final tier is tier 1 or tier 2 or tier 3. We don't want to do this for the disqualified ones, because the tier 1s actually get an automated email, and the tier 2s and 3s are interesting leads in the system, but we only want the data in the CRM. We don't yet want to take any action, because the way it's implemented, as you will see in the next few minutes, the data is in the CRM in just the right format, meaning like you have the data where you can usefully, for example, create automations or flows, workflows on the CRM side, because it's not just written as like a text field or something, but exactly the right type of data, so action can be taken on that as well. What you see here, auto delete, this is literally what that actually does. Is it's a normalization. So it takes the domain, and it normalizes a domain. And once the domain is normalized, because that's a free integration, once this action has completed, this will mark this row as yes, the row can be auto deleted. And the way this will only run if tier contains any data and if the auto delete actually has run. So this is where you get to this point of, okay, now the work on this row is completed. Now you can delete it. And this is also the normalization happens from my auto delete to my auto delete. So it's kind of a nonsensical thing in itself, but it just means this thing has run. Now you can delete it. Okay, let's switch over to the enrichment. I went over it quickly. Maybe I should have done that now. But anyway, so what we are seeing here is the data is coming in from the other table. We pull in more of that data. So in this table, I have all the context from the other table, meaning basically I look at the lead's LinkedIn URL. And if that is in the other table, which it is, pull in all the other data into this table. And then we have like the complete table from table 1, also in table 2. What happens here? So always super important, normalized company. That must be in every workflow, because you don't write, hey, whatever, noticed you work at Clario integrated systems.io or whatever. Of course, you want to have like a smoother name. So what I really like is when you use normalize company with a little Clagent prompt. What that means is, because there's also, I think, an integration for that, but you can tune it a little bit. So for example, realty.com, I think that's how I would talk to a person as well, like at realty.com, right? Instead of realty. But for other companies, that is not the case. Chevrolet, you don't want to say Chevrolet Inc. or whatever. So this is where the actual conversationalization, I don't even know if that's a word, but I can definitely say it, comes in. So you want to have that in a smooth way. Anyways, too much detail. Then here we have the final tier, which is map, and super simple. We run a waterfall starting with lead magic, giving us the validated work email. We also run it through Apollo in this case, because we do have an Apollo key. So why not run it if we didn't find an email with the other providers in the workflow? And here it becomes interesting. So for example, and I want to switch to Attio to the view quickly in order to get this tier 3, tier 2 in here the right way. This is what you need to do. On the Attio side, I need to know what is the list ID of the tier field. So this field where we have tier 3 has a list ID. That is not the value itself. That is just the list where this goes in. So this is the ID for that. And what then needs to be built is this custom API call, which is basically just a ton of JSON. So what's the right endpoint? Where do I get into Attio in order to write that data? That's all based on the email. And then this has to be constructed. That looks very wild. And that is when you're a no-coder, you need to work with a lot of AI in order to write that JSON and to troubleshoot it. And you need to get into the documentation itself, because it kind of usually gets you like 99% there, but not 100%. And from here on, you see, and I'm not going to go into all of this JSON, but what you see is we now have the, sorry, where is it? I have to correct myself. The pick list thing was actually for Apollo, not for Attio. For Attio, you just write it in just the correct JSON syntax into Attio. And what happens with this API call is taking all the data we have, which is who's the lead, what is the general lead enrichment data, what is the tier, what is the email that we found, and it writes all of this so it shows up in Attio just the right way. This is what makes it magical, because it's like really well integrated and makes all the difference how how automated and how qualitative that system feels. I don't have screenshots for the Apollo part, but you have to imagine that's basically how every sequencer looks like just with Apollo interface. And you need all of these data points here, the list ID, the funding stage ID, the contact ID, all of that, because you need to put it into the API calls into Apollo. So since there apparently is no upsert call, which would like either insert or update the account, you need to update the account if it already exists. So you need to kind of look up contact, look up if this email address is already existent in Apollo. If it is, get the contact ID. If it isn't, you have to create it. So what you see here, this is why it looks like not very interesting, but what goes in here is really all of this logic that I just said. Contact already existing. Yes, give me the ID. Take that ID and update that ID. If it's not existing, create the contact, which is what you see here. And in detail, this is not an API session or a ClayGen session or whatever. I'm just going into this to show like what's necessary in order to get something like that across the line. This is then the API call for creating a contact, which writes the first name, last name, work email. Here we have the list IDs that we pulled in earlier. All of this just has to be structured right. So use Sonnet for that or Claude for that in order to look at the API documentation and implement this the right way. Test it back and forth. Does it write correctly? No, it doesn't write. Put the error code into Claude and then troubleshoot your way into getting this right. But then again, it just magically shows up in the sequencer. It's much easier with an integrated sequencer like Instantly or SmartLead or something like that, because you can just literally say add enrichment, add SmartLead, and then you can like map the fields and you're good to go. This is kind of the manual version of that with the API call, but then you're off to the races. This is what makes it magical. This is what makes it an ongoing system is that it is fed automatically, but what makes it magical is this part where it just shows up in the systems where it's supposed to be, in the data in the right format, and it shows up in the systems where it's supposed to be in order to take action on that. And what's beautiful, the action is happening automatically. And since it's also in the CRM, the client can like layer on different actions because they have the right data in their system of record. So this was what I wanted to show, integrated lead scoring system, how it looks end to end. I hope this was interesting to somebody. I would imagine that's very hard to watch something like that 45 minutes. But if you're curious how such a system looks, I hope this was helpful. Thanks for watching. Reach out for questions.